Hey guys, it's me Jay. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the 1990s. Like I said, my video on the 2000s was very successful. My video on the 2010s was even more successful. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the 1990s. You know, I love the 1990s because, like I said, that's the decade I grew up in. I was a child during that era, and most of my vivid, clear memories of the categories of things I'm going to talk about were things from that particular decade. Yeah, I was an adult, a young adult in the 2000s, and uh, a person in their 30s in the 2010s. But as you become older, your life becomes more consumed with your personal problems. You're not as focused on fun things like pop culture. So, anyway, I'm gonna start this talk off with politics. Like I said, I was not so engrossed in the political world at the time because I was a child. But some of the things that I was kind of, I don't know, forced to learn, or when I first became interested in social events or the news, um, they were from the 1990s. And the decade started off with George W. Bush as president. He announced in one of his Union addresses that it was a new world order. And what he meant by this was nothing to do with wrestling, like we're going to talk about later on in the talk, in the video. But what he meant by this in this context was that the Soviet Union had just felt falling apart. And for 40 years, the Soviet Union was the main adversary of the United States. We were engaged in something called the Cold War. And this Cold War discussion had dominated the political discourse since the end of World War II. And that means in the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s. But now in the 90s, kind of finishing off what his predecessor had done, his predecessor being Ronald Reagan, he proceeded over the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1991, you could see it on CNN. It was just a lot of celebration. Germans from both sides of Germany were crossing over the border finally that they hadn't been able to do for many years. And it was just a really historic thing. Um, and it really changed the world. But for the Soviet Union and for Eastern Europe in general, it had been dominated by not just communism, but by the autocratic systems itself for so many decades. It was a huge adjustment. And unfortunately, for certain parts of Eastern Europe, like Yugoslavia, it resulted in the breakup of the Republic of Yugoslavia into several states, and even resulted in the genocide of many minorities in Yugoslavia, such as the Bosnians in 1995 and the Albanians in 1998 under the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, which I talked about in the beginning of my 2000s video. That it's the year 2000 they finally got him. But during the 90s, he was one of the villains of the 1990s, because here we are as the world, a post World War II world, and we made a commitment never to have this happen ever again in our lifetime. It's happened to the Jewish people in Germany, and here it is happening again to Muslims in Yugoslavia. And it was just tragic. Another genocide that happened in the 1990s and 1994 was the Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide has its roots further back, going back to Belgian colonialism. At the time when Belgium was ruling Rwanda, they kind of played one side against another, and they kind of put the Tutsis and the lighter skinned Tutsis in charge over the Hutus. So when they left, the Hutus assumed power, and the Hutus kind of lashed out against the Tutsis. And that was the worst. That was the worst genocide that we'd seen up until that point in modern times. And the worst part about it was the world overlooked it. They turned a blind eye to it. They figured it was just African infighting, and many people died. If you want to know more about that, I suppose you watch the movie starring Don Cheadle called Hotel Rwanda. It's a really emotional movie, and it'll really open your eyes to a conflict that you might have not known that much about from that era. And locally, we had a lot of things going on too, because we had a lot of racial violence in the 1990s in a lot of different cities. It was sort of like the 2010s, where you had this advancement in African American rights and African American civil rights, but at the same time, you had a huge backlash against it. And one such example of that was the Rodney King riots in 1992. Rodney King riots in 1992 was just a news event that just shook the entire country. The whole country was on edge because here was this man. He'd been caught on camera. These cops had been caught on camera beating up this man on camera. A new technology that had just been invented and now is being utilized to bring supposed justice to this man, and these cops get off scot free. And the city of Los Angeles just wasn't going to take it, and for 4 or 5 days, the city just erupted in violence. Also, in my city, New York, there was tremendous violence in the Crown Heights area of Brooklyn between the Hasidic Jewish community and the West Indian community. Why? The incident started when young West Indian young man Galvin Cato was run over by a Hasidic bus, and nobody did anything to stop it. They completely ignored him. They let him die in the street. And the neighborhood residents, they just weren't going to take it anymore. And also, many of the white residents of New York were very angry and upset that African American we'd had our first one and only African American mayor in New York. So, just like I mentioned in the 2000s, you had this tremendous advancement in African American rights and political representation, but at the same time, you have this tremendous backlash. So here we have our first black mayor in Mayor Dinkins, and this tremendous backlash against him by Hasidic residents and by Italian American residents in Bensonhurst with the killing and beating of Yusuf Hawkins. Another incident that occurred that was racially motivated in the 1990s was the trial of O.J. Simpson. The trial of O.J. Simpson was very unique and unprecedented because never before in our country's history had we ever allowed cameras into a courtroom. So this whole thing became a spectacle. It was more than just a trial. It was a complete spectacle, a joke. His defendant and friend got Cato Kalin became famous. The judge became famous. His lawyers, Johnny Cochran and Robert Kardashian Sr., became famous and infamous. And Johnny Cochran coined the phrase, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Now, what made OJ's situation very unique was that um, he was a high profile black celebrity who was married to a white lady, Nicole Brown, and was accused of murdering her. But at the same time, prior to this trial, he'd been a very beloved black celebrity. He even said one time before this that he said, I'm not black, I'm OJ. In other words, I'm exempt from a lot of the racial discrimination that occurs against other African Americans because I'm famous. And obviously, he found out that wasn't true because the entirety of white America turned on him and all accused him of being guilty, even though you had this racist cop, Mark Furman, who was clearly targeting him because of his race. Now, it's come out years later after OJ had done his time that perhaps he did do it. But for many African Americans, fresh off the Rodney King verdict, they didn't really care if he did it or not. The fact was that he was a celebrity who got off, and um, and he, for a minute, they really, the African American community really empathized with him, whether he did it or not. It really didn't matter. But it made Johnny Cochran very famous, and it made the court case infamous. Everyone was talking about it. It was a national phenomenon. This case, and even me as a kid at the time, was even captivated. Excuse me, by it, seeing him, seeing this case, seeing the day to day drama of this case. You know, the high speed Bronco chase and all that. I didn't fully grasp a lot of what was really going on, but it was just wild to see. Um, Later on, we would experience this in other decades, like with Casey Anthony and stuff. But for the first time ever, this was new. This was something new. You know what I mean? It never been done before. Cameras in a courtroom where we could actually see, um, a trial of a high profile celebrity going on. That's never been done. Um, yeah, so but it really tore the nation apart racially because I remember in school a lot of the Caucasian faculty was really upset that OJ didn't go to jail for the murder of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown. A lot of the African American faculty was very happy he didn't go to jail for that same murder. So yeah, it is what it is. Um, in terms of other political stuff that went on at the time, um, it was the election. It was 1992 was the election of Bill Clinton to office, his first term. George Bush was really riding high in the early 90s because, like I said, he gave the New World Order speech. But in giving that speech, he also warned other tyrants around the world, like Saddam Hussein, who was invading Kuwait at the time, that Saddam should not make the actions that he was making. Saddam was invading Kuwait at the time to try to monopolize and capitalize on their oil fields. And the United States felt like they had to step in to protect not only Kuwaitis, but the Kurdish people. Saddam was ethnically targeting the Kurdish people in Iraq, and George Bush felt he had to step in. So for 6 months, we went in to Iraq and Kuwait, and we fought off the invasion of Kuwait, and we won. We didn't get Saddam; that would take later. We didn't take him out of power, but we did win. And this was the first. This was the first war to be featured on cable TV, really live coverage, right in front of our faces where we could see it. It was sort of like Vietnam, but less brutal. And they used these infrared bombs during this. So anyway, coming off of this, uh, Bush was really riding high. He thought, there's no way I cannot win re-election in 1992. I'm doing good. I'm guaranteed a second term. You know, I ended the Cold War and I stopped Saddam from invading Kuwait. Well, he was wrong. While on a campaign trail, the economy just tanked, and he made a promise to the American people. And when he said, during the campaign, read my lips, no new taxes, and he proceeded to raise taxes. And for he and Ronald Reagan, lower taxes had been their mantra. So when he proceeded to raise taxes on the American people, they weren't going to elect him again. So the governor of Arkansas, young, fresh face, with a very outspoken, feminist wife, a product of the 1960s, a baby boomer, William Jefferson Clinton, came in. The comeback kid, why they call him that was because in the beginning of the campaign, they had a lot of scandals against him, that he had illicit affairs. The first one was Jennifer Flowers, that he had sex with her. And people thought for sure, he's not going to win. You know what I mean? Because American people are never going to accept this philanderer, this cheater, this adulterer as their president. They have a high moral standard. So anyway, during the Super Bowl in 1993, he gets on TV and he admits, yeah, I was in an affair with Jennifer Flowers, and Hillary says she forgives him. Little did we know that it would eventually become a theme with Bill. Bill Bill just couldn't keep his little Bill in place. He was a playboy type guy. You know what I mean? But no different from what other presidents like JFK had done in the past, or even Roosevelt. But this time we had TV cameras. You know what I mean? That's the difference. But he was the comeback kid. People didn't care, and he had a famous line in his debate with Bush in '92, and where he said, "It's about the economy, stupid," because Bush had tried to push his success in the war as a reason why he should he should be reelected. And Clinton was like, "It's about the economy, stupid." Some people say that there was the introduction of Texas business tycoon Ross Perot, and how he kind of split the vote with a third party, which is how Clinton got elected. And they said the same thing about Ralph Nader in 2000, and Ron Paul in 2008, and they always say that. But despite whatever, Bill Clinton got elected, and his presidency started in 1993. And I remember that I was in the second grade when Bill Clinton and George Bush Sr. had their election, and they were talking about who would we vote for if we could vote. They did a mock election, and I said Bill Clinton. I just liked Bill Clinton's attitude. I liked his swag. I liked the fact that he went on the Arsenio Hall show and he played the saxophone. He just seemed like a regular, down-to-earth guy, and he made history because he was the first Democratic president elected since Jimmy Carter. since 1980, and he was from the South. As you recall, the South was at one time was all Democrat after the Civil War and before, and then switched over to Republican during the 60s. And by this time, the 1990s, the South was completely, solidly Republican, like it is now. It was a red state region. So for him to come out of Hope, Arkansas, and win the election as a as a as a as a Democrat was tremendous. So yeah, yeah, we had a new president, and his theme was Fleetwood Mac's "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow." And immediately in 1993, the first his first time in office, his first year in office, immediately he's faced with a problem, and that problem was the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. It wasn't. It was the first time that Islamic militants tried to attack us, and it wasn't as bad as it would later become, but it was pretty bad. They caught the suspect, Ramzi Youssef, and the guy who was behind it, Omar, um, Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind sheikh, a blind Egyptian sheikh that was behind the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. And then Mr. Clinton's presidency would be rocked by another issue, which was internal, which was the breaking up of the People's Temple compound. I mean, not the People's Temple, excuse me, the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, led by cult leader David Koresh. Yeah, this cult they were messianic. They were proclaiming that David Koresh was the Messiah, was the second coming of Christ, and they were stockpiling weapons in Waco, Texas, and they had kids there, and the government had to take action. They had no other choice but to um, invade this um, invade this compound, because if not, so these kids would have died. But the reaction to this, and the reaction to another government standoff in Washington State, Ruby Ridge, caused a lot of people that were anti-government and anti white supremacist, and pro-gun people to really go off, and it eventually led to the attack on the Murrah Federal Building in 1995 in Oklahoma City, which was the worst domestic terrorist attack that we've ever experienced on our soil. So, in terms of being very divisive, yes, it was extremely divisive. And it was also amped up by talk radio talking heads like Rush Limbaugh. People like this that were becoming very popular. They were very against Clinton. And we saw that in not only the Oklahoma City bombing, not only the Ruby Ridge standoff with Randy Weaver and his followers, and not only Oklahoma City, but in the midterm elections in 1994, when Newt Gingrich, who was the voice of the opposition against Clinton, decided that he had what he called a contract to America, because Bill Clinton had tried to pass, like other presidents before him, tried to pass a universal health care plan. That was one of his initiatives going in. And the Republicans didn't want it, and they blocked it, and they blocked it, and they had what they called a contract to America. In other words, they wanted to cut these social programs. They wanted to switch from welfare to workfare. In other words, taking millions of Americans that were dependent on welfare and putting them to work. This was the theme in the 90s. This was the plan. This was not from Clinton. This was from the Republicans in the White House, in the House of Representatives, led by House Speaker Newt Gingrich. So the whole decade was kind of defined by Republicans and right wingers going against Bill Clinton, trying to find more and more dirt on him and trying to fight him every step of the way in the things that he was trying to do. But in terms of international stuff, like I said, you had those two genocides, Rwanda and Bosnia, and you had the several other Yugoslavian wars. But you did have some good things, you know. You had the Oslo Accords in 1993, which was signed by Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, which basically established Israel partially recognizing Palestinian sovereignty and Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, finally recognizing Israel to a degree. Of course, on both sides, you had militants that were very, and this took place, started with secret agreements in Oslo, Norway. That's why they're called the Oslo Accords. But on both sides of the equation, you had people that were against it. You know, you had Jewish extremists like Baruch Goldstein that walked into a mosque in Hebron and started opening fire on a Friday night when they were worshiping and killing several people. Then you had, of course, Muslims that were against it. But the name that sticks out and the incident that sticks out was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995 by Jewish extremist Yigal Amir. This was like the Sadat thing. Sadat signs a peace treaty with Israel, his people murder him. Rabin does that, and his people murder him. You know what I mean? So, one step forward, two steps back, and it seems like in the Middle East. But one conflict that did get solved in the 1990s was the conflict between the Irish Republic and Britain and the United Kingdom over Northern Ireland. They signed the final treaty and they came to peace after the 1980s being so bloody and so divisive and so full of terror, what they call the Troubles. So Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were able to work that historic one out. But Bill Clinton was unable to work out any sort of lasting peace agreements with Arafat. Once again, like Obama, like Trump, like the rest of them, Bush Jr., Bush Sr., they tried, but nothing there. You know, I'm not. I could do a million of these, and you'll see in every decade it ends kind of the same. You know, and it's really a shame. But in terms of technology, now the 1990s was really defined by technology because it was the invention of the internet in 1995. For the first time ever, people had access to information at the speed of at the tip of their fingertip, at the point of their fingertips. You had AOL, you had Netscape Navigator, you had Internet Explorer, and it really opened up the world to so many people. But it also opened up a lot of dangers. You know what I mean? Because in the beginning, in the chat room era, you know, people were going online and chatting with random people, and sometimes they were meeting them, and sometimes the people that they were meeting were getting hurt, you know. But it was still new and exciting because you could now at school you could ask your friend for his email or her email or her screen name on AOL, and it was very primitive. It was at that time where you and like you couldn't be on the phone if you know your mom and stuff would yell at you like, get off the phone, get off the net. I have to use the phone. So it was a really primitive technology, but it was different than what we'd ever seen before, and it would change the face of what was possible, and it would make Bill Gates a household name. Bill Gates launching Windows 1995. Space technology. We launched the first Hubble spacecraft in 1997 that allowed us to go to the moon again and to probe Mars, which now, when you think of it, it's kind of like Stone Age shit, but it was pretty cool to us back then, you know? And cloning technology became possible in the 1990s. We even cloned a sheep. Her name was Dolly in 1997. And then this sparked a bunch of debates on whether cloning was ethical. People said, well, maybe cloning is not ethical. Maybe it's not ethical to play God and to clone a living thing. Because if they could clone this sheep, then they could clone you, And people didn't really want that. And then became the debate about stem cells. That, yeah, you can use stem cells to solve certain medical conditions like muscular dystrophy and everything, and to, restore cells that are dead in certain people. So, I say any advancement in medical technology is a good advancement, right? What else in the technological sphere? That was pretty much it. The internet, like I said, they dominated the era, and you had a bunch of these .coms that they really rose in stock. But by the decade's end, unfortunately, it all went to bust. So, yeah. In terms of movies, the most successful movie of the decade was Titanic. Titanic was produced by James Cameron, and just like in the beginning of the decade, James Cameron dominated. James Cameron started off in the beginning of the decade with Terminator 2, which many will say is the best sequel ever made, and the special effects were just fabulous. But what he did in 1998 with Titanic, he took it to a whole nother level, because here he is telling this story from like 70 years ago about something that us kids in the 90s really couldn't even relate to. And they had Leonardo DiCaprio, Claire Danes, and he's captivating us for like 3 hours. And you're just like, man, James Cameron is incredible. You know? You know what I mean? Like the movie was just, it was sad. It was dominated by the song My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion, which you heard everywhere in the 90s. It was just like, man, can somebody shut up with this song? My heart will go on, my heart will go on. But oh well, it was cool. I like seeing Claire Danes' breasts too. That scene where she tells Leonardo DiCaprio, paint me like one of your French girls. That was cool. SNL was pretty big. Okay. Other movies that were great throughout the decade, I say the name that sticks out in the 90s, and this is why I bring out one of the names that sticks out in the 90s, and this is why I bring out SNL, is Adam Sandler. Adam Sandler had a lot of funny comedies in the 90s. Waterboy, Billy Madison. He came off the success of SNL. He, David Spade, and Chris Farley. Unfortunately, we lost Chris Farley in 1997. But for Adam Sandler, in the comedy realm, he dominated. He dominated. the '90s, because he was just so goofy and so funny, and the things he would say was just out of this world, out of control, like in Waterboy and Happy Gilmore and everything. So, yeah. But another serious actor who dominated in the 1990s was Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks, and of course, started out in the TV show Bosom Buddies in the 80s, but in the 90s, he won an Oscar back to back 2 years in a row. 2 years in a row. Philadelphia and Forrest Gump. 1993, Philadelphia, where he played a lawyer inflicted with HIV who was discriminated against because of his sexuality and his status. And in 1994, he played the dim-witted Forrest Gump, who that movie became one of the most classic films ever made by Robert Zemeckis. Again, Robert Zemeckis takes us back in time to the 60s. In a way, the 80s was the 90s was very nostalgic towards the 60s. We saw movies like Malcolm X, movies like Oliver Stone's JFK. Uh, you know, in a way, Bill Clinton was very much a product of the 60s. So, in kind of the way that the 2010s was towards the 80s, the 90s was kind of like that towards the 60s. You know, in 1999, the Beatles released their number ones album. So, boomers really reveled and celebrated their culture in the 60s, and Forrest Gump was an example of that. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Anyway, so another movie I loved in the 90s was Dances with Wolves. It was one of the first movies that really got me into history because of Kevin Costner's performance, and I'm about to talk about Kevin Costner in a different movie in a little while. Um, Kevin Costner's performance was incredible in this movie. Just the parts when he's hunting with the Lakota Indians, and he says, they call him Lieutenant, and just the scenes, the shooting of the scenes are incredible. And Kevin Costner, yes, in the 1990s, is an actor I think of as well because of his phenomenal performance by Whitney Houston. Whitney Houston in this film was just perfect. I talked before about how the Titanic song dominated in the 1990s, and that was true in 1998. But in 1993, Whitney Houston, "I Will Always Love You," her interpretation of Dolly Parton's song, uh, "I Will Always Love You," just blew everybody away because it was a better interpretation. And to this day, people people will sing the song. Try to sing. It's probably the hardest song to ever to sing in history. Nobody can sing this song. I will always love you. And Whitney Houston also blew the performance out when she sang the national anthem in 1991 at the World Series. So that was really my gist in terms of movies for that decade. And of course, um, you know, I mentioned the Matrix movies. I mentioned Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, which did really well selling wise, but didn't do really well in the box office. I mean, it did really well in the box office, but it didn't do well critically. Another one I want to mention uh, is is the hood movies, the hood genre of movies that really rose to prominence in the 1990s, thanks to uh, films by John Singleton. John Singleton brought a whole new drama of movies, a whole new genre of movies to the front screen with his first movie, Boys in the Hood, then Baby Boy, uh, then other ones like Menace to Society, Dead Prez, others that really showed the gritty life of the inner city. And later, Ice Cube would put a comedic spin on it and do it with Friday. Like he would portray the hood movies, but he would do it with a comedic spin on Friday. So it wasn't as depressing as Boys in the Hood or Menace to Society, right? Or Jason Lyric, but it was just as hoody and just as gritty, and it became a very famous film franchise in 1995. Um, and that segues me into music. In music in 1995, excuse me, in the 1990s, we saw a whole bunch of different things. First off, we saw in rock and roll, we saw the death of um, kind of the traditional rock and roll, like the glam metal that had been popular in the 80s. Bands like Van Halen, bands like even Guns N' Roses. We saw the death of that and the rise of Seattle in the rock and roll scene, and Kurt Cobain and Pearl Jam with their first albums in the early 90s, particularly Nirvana with their first album, Nevermind, with the little baby with the erection swimming in the water. And that really brought in alternative rock and changed the face of rock from what it was to what it became. But then Kurt Cobain in 1993, he dies of a heroin overdose, and um, he's sort of the last breath of rock and roll. Because even though in the latter part of the decade, rock and roll would come back and it'd be kind of mixed with rap, because you would have like Linkin Park, Korn, Limp Bizkit, Stain, new metal type stuff that had more of a rap sound to it, but it was still rock and roll. Rock and roll, the traditional way that it was, would never really come back, after the death of Kurt Cobain. But hip hop was on the ascendancy in the 1990s, and it was due to two things. One, the rise of West Coast rap. Dr. Dre decided to leave um, NWA, go on his own. Ice Cube decided to leave NWA, go on his own. And each, especially with Dr. Dre, with his Chronic album, 1992, created the West Coast sound, the G-Funk sound, combining elements of hip hop with funk to create a really smooth and melodic sound that we hadn't really seen in hip hop before. And he brought out his protege, Snoop Dogg, and he brought out the Dog Pound and Warren G and all this. And they completely dominated the decade. The early part of the decade, to the point where other artists from other parts of the country, particularly New York, couldn't really get ahead in edgewise. Uh, Wu-Tang Clan had released their album 36 Chambers in 1993. That didn't do so good. And Nas had released Illmatic in 1994, and that didn't do so good. Now, if you ask people today, well, what's some of your favorite albums? And they will say, well, um, my favorite album in rap. You say, well, what was your favorite album in rap? They'll say, "Oh, one of my favorite albums in rap is Illmatic," but they're lying because Illmatic didn't do so good. Maybe they got into it later, but at the time, Illmatic didn't do so good because the West had it on lock. But the guy there was a savior in the East, and that savior was a chubby man from Brooklyn by the name of Christopher Wallace, aka Biggie Smalls. Biggie Smalls put East Coast back on the map when he was signed by P. Diddy. Because his album in 1994, the same year as Nas's album, Ready to Die, came out, his album came out, and his album had melody, his album had beats, and his album just blew everything West Coast away to the point where now West Coast and East Coast are evenly matched, and it escalates into a war between the two, between West Coast represented by Suge Knight's label Death Row, East Coast represented by Sean P. Diddy Combs' label Bad Boy, and Snoop. Tupac get put in jail for allegedly raping this woman, and he gets shot outside Quad Studios, and he puts out a diss record for Biggie, Hit 'Em Up, and they have one of the worst beefs, and he gets signed to Death Row, and the two labels now are embroiled in this beef, and people have to choose sides between East Coast rap represented by Biggie, Busta Rhymes, Nas, and now Jay-Z coming out in '96 with Reasonable Doubt, and West Coast rap represented by these guys. So it doesn't end well for either side. It ends in the death of first Tupac and then Biggie, and really hip hop has never really recovered from that because these two were such big legends in the game, especially Biggie. Even though he only had 2 albums, he had an album coming out at that time, Life After Death, and Puffy had his first album coming out, P. Diddy and the Family, in 1997 as well. And one of the biggest songs in that album in 1997 was I've Been Missing You, his cover of Sting's and the Police, I've Been Watching You. And it was just tremendous. The song was everywhere. And even though it was a song dedicated to his dead friend, people danced to it and they partied to it, and they still love that song to this day. Another big hip hop group that made it onto the scene in the 1990s was the Fugees. The Fugees was kind of like an alternative rap group. They had incorporated elements of R&B, hip hop, rock, soul into their album The Score, and that album just completely dominated in 1996, and was one of the first albums that I bought, as a kid. But that was kind of the thing in hip hop, was like the blending of hip hop and R&B. You had TLC, it was very dominant during that era. They released their first album on the TLC tip in 1992, and it was kind of like a hip hop sort of album, and it was really good because we were coming right off the AIDS, the really big AIDS scare in the '80s, and a lot of people weren't really talking about safe sex, but here you had TLC coming out with condoms on their clothes and Left Eye with a condom on her eye, really raising awareness to kids and safe sex. As the decade would go on, their success would lead to more girl groups like 702, like Destiny's Child, and boy groups like NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, for example. But none of the girl groups could top TLC. They had another album in 1995 called Crazy Sexy Cool, with Chile as the sexy one, T-Buzz as the cool one, and Nutta as the crazy one. This was the same year that she had burned down her boyfriend Andre Rison's house. So everybody was like talking about it. Some of the great songs from that one is Waterfalls, again addressing the HIV epidemic, because by this time in the 90s, artists had learned from Michael Jackson and Madonna that they could take videos to the next level, and they could use videos to tell a story, which is what they did. In Waterfalls, they used the medium of video to tell a cohesive story. Um, Another successful artist outside of the hip hop and R&B genre in 1996 was Alanis Morissette. She seemed to set the world on fire with her album, The Jagged Little Pill, with songs like You Ought to Know, which we found out later was dedicated to Dave Coulier, the uncle in Full House. And that just bugged everybody out, because it's like she's talking about this dude like like he's like the number one dude out there, and he's Dave Coulier from Full House. He's Uncle Joey. You know what I mean? Like, it was just weird. But that album was one of the highest grossing albums of 1996, and you heard those songs everywhere. Another person that I want to talk about in 1996, and I loved her songs, and I had a good girl on my school bus that was really obsessed with her music, was Toni Braxton. Unbreak My Heart is probably one of the most beautiful songs that I've ever heard in all of my life. And Toni Braxton looked so beautiful in that video, and so magnificent and so elegant. Yeah. So, like I said, um, towards the end of the decade, you started to move closer to boy band groups. This guy named Lou Pearlman, who had witnessed the success of New Kids on the Block in the 80s, um, kind of wanted to do the exact same thing with in the 90s. So he brought out Backstreet Boys. Later, he brought out NSYNC. And he brought out, I think he brought out a few girl groups. But unfortunately, now there's a documentary out there about him, and he had less than honorable intentions. In fact, he was a pedophile. So he didn't do it for the betterment of music, but we did get a lot of good songs like I Want It That Away by the Backstreet Boys and Bye 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 by NSYNC that are classics to this day. um, in the hip hop world, after the death of Biggie and Pac, people kind of toned down the violence, they toned down the hardcore stuff, and they kind of went back. They had the Sonny Suit era where Biggie and Mace would, they do this soft style rap. But then in 1998, the game just changed. Um, the game changed to such a degree that you had the return of hardcore hip hop, the return of DMX, the return of in the debut of DMX, the debut of Cannabis, the debut of Big Pun, the first Latino rapper to go platinum. You know, then in the middle of little did we know that we riddled to middlemen who didn't do diddly. Big Pun, he changed the game in hip hop. 1998, Capital Punishment was one of the best albums I've ever heard to this day. You know, Latinos in the music business were making it really big in the 1990s. One example is Selena. Um, Selena wasn't really known before her death um, because she focused more on like Mexican style Tejano music, and she was just starting to break into the pop world with her tremendous dance moves and tremendous stage presence. But by 1997, the movie that J Lo had out and that starred her and Edward James Olmos made J Lo a star. And 2 years later, J Lo herself released her first album, On the Six. which was co-produced by Puffy and had a song featuring Big Pun and Fat Joe. So, and also Christina Aguilera, she kind of was neck and neck with Britney Spears in 1997. She had Genie in a Bottle. She was a sexy Latina girl. So, yeah, the decade started off with Gloria Estefan, and then Gloria kind of had an accident, and you didn't really see her anymore. And then, you know, and then yeah, J Lo would come to dominate in the 2000s. I mentioned Ja Rule, my 2000s video, and she did a lot of songs with Ja Rule, a lot of collaborations with Ja Rule. But I think if Selena had lived, she'd have been the one to do those collaborations. But yeah, for Latinos in the English market, you know, yeah, Christina Aguilera, yeah, yeah, in 1999, Ricky Martin broke through with "Living La Vida Loca," which was in 1999 was probably a phenomenon song. Like you heard this song everywhere. You would have thought this dude was gonna be the next Elvis Presley. You know, he was that popular. But yeah, that was the diversity of music in the 90s. You had so many different sounds, so many different streams coming from so many different places. Like I said, another thing you started to see in the 1990s was uh, um, rock and rollers coming and trying to put rap into um, their repertoires. You know, like groups like Limp Bizkit and Korn and later Linkin Park. Linkin Park became the most successful at doing this, but I think Limp Bizkit and Kid Rock were the first initial ones. Now, a lot of people, understandably so, they don't like Kid Rock. They're like, fuck him because of his racism and his politics. But Politics Society, and he had a great album in 1998 that a lot of people liked. Excuse me. And it pioneered a sound, the rock rap sound. He performed with Run DMC, excuse me, at the VMAs. So, I guess we can't doesn't excuse them. I'm just saying, rap rock and new metal was sort of a thing in the late 90s. Um, uh, Beyond that, um, in the world of television, now television in the 90s was very like it was a contrast era because television had always been afraid to take chances. Now they're not because of their streaming services, but in those days, like in the 80s, man, they were afraid to take chances big time. Yeah, shows like Growing Pains, yeah, shows like Cosby Show, shows like um, Alf, shows like Different Strokes, shows like Webster. But in the 90s, that all changed because of one show, Married with Children. Fox came out. Fox was the fourth network to join the big three. For years on television, there had only been three networks. And then Fox came out, and they're the third network. And they have to take chances. They have to try something new. And one of the something news that they tried was um, coming out with these edgier shows like The Simpsons and like Married with Children, you know? And when they did that, people were just shocked at first. It's hard to believe now, but The Simpsons at one time was considered an edgy show. And social conservatives in this country were against The Simpsons, even with a character like Ned Flanders, because they felt like a character like Ned Flanders was lampooned, made fun of for his Christian beliefs, and Bart would say things like "eat my shorts," and some parents didn't like that. And of course, Married with Children they didn't like because it didn't portray the conventional family outlook on things. Now, contrast that again with, like I said, shows geared towards the African American community that was very wholesome. Shows like The Cosby Show, which unbelievably, Cosby Show actually got a lot of flack because It featured an African American family that was upper middle class, and people said it really wasn't based on reality. But to me, I think that these shows were like, um, it could have easily have been a white family. It wasn't necessarily to show that they were African American. Like they were going to show that they were traditional American values. And for the first time ever in this country, an African American show featuring an African American family was number one in this country. And even to the point where during the Rodney King riots, the mayor of the city said, "Why don't you go home and watch the finale of the Cosby Show?" But even in that show, Cliff Huxtable wasn't afraid to take chances. He said to Theo said that he would just be a normal person, quote unquote. And Cliff said to him that was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. And he still had to get good grades. And Cliff brought him into the world and could take him out of the world. You know? So they even took chances. I mean, Fresh Prince of Bel Air, another show about it's based on the life of manager Benny Medina when he went to live with Motown head Berry Gordy. And even in that show, they took chances. They had this one episode where Carlton gets a gun. This other episode where Carlton is pulled over by a cop. And you also had the TGIF lineup. To counter the edgy program that was going on in Fox, you had ABC have the TGIF lineup, which was very unique and very revolutionary. You had a show produced by Jim Henson's studio called The Dinosaurs. And in this show was dinosaurs. It was a show about dinosaurs. And the baby was famous for saying, "Not the mama, not the mama." But in this show, they tackled things like drug use, they tackled things like racism, they tackled things like global warming. And the show's finale, all the dinosaurs died because of this meteorite, and their government refused to do anything. That's kind of like foreshadowing in a way. Um, then you had, on the same TGIF lineup, you had Family Matters, which was a spinoff of Perfect Strangers. And again, another upper class African American show that dealt with some hard issues, especially with Carl Winslow, the father, the patriarch of the family, being a cop. And you also have Boy Meets World. Now, Boy Meets World for later millennials really defined what it means to be a millennial, because this show was so awesome. A lot of boys had crushes on Topanga. I think in the 90s, if you ask boys who was their top three crushes on TV, they would say Amy Jo Johnson, the Pink Ranger from Power Rangers, um, uh, Topanga from Boy Meets World, and Kelly Kapowski from Saved by the Bell. Now, this show was very good too because it tackled drunkenness. Sean joined a cult. Um, it tackled friendship, and it also had a lot of wrestlers on it. One being Vader Leon White, which I liked, and it came on Fridays. And Ben Savage was a really good actor, and it dealt with an interracial relationship, but they really didn't make a big deal of it. Another high school show that I really loved as a kid was um, Saved by the Bell. Saved by the Bell was tremendous. They're bringing it back now for a revival, but the original, it was very simplistic, and people laugh at, at Jesse being addicted to caffeine pills and saying, "I'm so excited," and I'm so excited, and then she goes off and she does Showgirls a year after it's canceled in '94, and people want to see this movie Showgirls because Elizabeth Berkley was in it, and they were fans of Saved by the Bell. But Saved by the Bell taught me a lot of things. It taught me words like discrimination. And I like Slater because he was so cool, and it was fun. It was a fun TV show. It was nothing to be too serious about. Uh, um, in terms of that, and for animation, um, the '90s was the most important era. I mentioned The Simpsons, but you also had Ren and Stimpy. You also had Beavis and Butthead. You also had South Park. You know, uh, you had Rugrats, all these animation shows that took animation to another level. Daria, people weren't afraid to watch animation anymore. They weren't. Animation wasn't just kid stuff because these animation cartoons were going places that regular live action cartoons couldn't really go. Like when they created a character like Eric Cartman that was anti-Semitic and racist, and he would sing songs like "There's too many minorities in my water park." Couldn't get away with that with a live action character, but you could with Eric Cartman. You could with Peter Griffin. You could to an extent with Bart Simpson. So the Simpsons got the ball rolling in 1989. As the 90s progressed, these other cartoons really made our parents kind of say, well, "What are you guys watching?" And another thing that was like that was Jerry Springer. You know, Jerry Springer was it was talk show craze really started in the 80s, but with Jesse Raphael and Oprah. But Jerry Springer took it to the next level because Jerry Springer would have people on the show fighting, people on the show throwing chairs, people on the show committing incest, people on the show meeting the Ku Klux Klan, a whole bunch of stuff. It just typified the decade. Jerry, and it was like everything was carefree because the president was getting oral sex in the White House. He was being accused of having several affairs with Paula Jones and other women. And he was Slick Willie and he was getting away with it. He was impeached, but people didn't really care. You know, it was just a fun time, a time to have fun. And that's what the 90s really was. It's the carefree 90s. People didn't care. You know, we had our scandals, we had our problems, but people generally didn't care. In sports, the Rangers made history. They broke their record, 45 years of never winning a Stanley Cup, and they won one in 1994. I was never a huge hockey fan or a sports fan at all, really, but this I do remember because everybody in my school was talking about it, and when they won, it was phenomenal, and it wasn't from my city. The Knicks went into the finals twice in the 1990s and lost. Michael Jordan retired in 1993 but came back in 1996 to have his 72 and 10 season, which was phenomenal. And he also made the movie Space Jam, which was a classic. Um, and like I said, the Yankees were a very dominant baseball team in the 1990s. On to professional wrestling. I know a lot of people don't really like when I talk about wrestling in some of my videos. Some people are not wrestling fans, but like I said, it was always a big part of my life. So I'm going to talk about it. In the beginning of the 1990s, uh, professional wrestling wasn't doing so well. Hulk Hogan had gone on the Arsenio Hall show and um, lied about steroids. He lied about using steroids. He said he never used steroids. People knew that was a lie. So attendance rates just dropped. And plus, the Iraqi storyline trying to capitalize on the war, saying that Sergeant Slaughter was a turncoat and that he was sympathetic to Iraq and he was a friend of Saddam Hussein was stupid. You know, Vince McMahon tried this in 2005 with Muhammad Hassan, and it didn't work, so it didn't work here either. And it really caused the audience to drop in 1992, 93, to the point where they had to go overseas just to pack a house in Wembley Stadium, you know? And even in 93 at WrestleMania 9, when they tried to bring Hulk Hogan back, it still didn't work. You know, they had a lot of dominant heels like Yokozuna, Ludwig Borga, and the Giant Gonzalez, but it was still not drawing a big audience. In 1994, they came to Madison Square Garden for the 10th anniversary of WrestleMania. They had a tremendous ladder match, brother against brother, Bret Hart against Owen Hart, and um, Owen Hart won, So he proved that he wasn't in Bret's shadow anymore. But Bret won the night by becoming the WWF champion for the second time. And this was kind of a signifying of a new era in the WWF, the new generation era. Because a couple months later, Hulk Hogan would leave the WWF and sign with WCW, Southern Rival. And and WWE would have to rebuild all over again, which was different to me because I like seeing Hulk Hogan and Macho Man in WWF, but when they both left in '94, I still kept watching, but it was different. And WCW began to grow in prominence. But before that, in the '80s, WCW had been kind of like a regional company. And it hadn't really had the mainstream success that it had, um, that WWF had because they didn't have the big stars. They didn't have Hogan. They didn't have Savage. They didn't have these big stars. But then they got these stars. But see, the problem was people were still upset with Hulk Hogan for lying on the Arsenio Hall show, saying that he didn't use steroids, and they knew he did. So in 1996, he turned to a bad guy, and he formed the NWO, and the ball was rolling from there. From there began the most successful boom period that that wrestling in general had ever seen. Because now that Hulk Hogan's a bad guy, people want to see, well, what's he going to do as a bad guy with Diesel and Razor Ramon on this channel, and him, together with him, trying to invade WCW and take them on. Then in September, Sting goes into the rafters. He doesn't talk for a year, and they drag out this long storyline in 1997 of Sting versus Hulk Hogan. You know, when's Sting gonna sign the contract? All he does is point the bat at Hogan. Doesn't say a word. And he beats up the whole NWO, and it culminates in Starrcade '97, where Bret Hart is a special referee. I'll get back to Bret later. So anyway, it's a fail because Mick Patrick, the referee, is supposed to do a fast count, but doesn't. He doesn't do a fast count. He does a normal count. So basically, Hulk Hogan, the heel, beats Sting. The big babyface has been built up for over a year, and the whole angle falls to shit. So then Bret Hart comes in and reverses it. But then Bret Hart just looked like he cheated, and Bret Hart was the biggest good guy ever coming off the heels of '97. Why? Because in 1996, Bret Hart at WrestleMania 12 had his, like I said, in WrestleMania 10 he won the title, and he had a dominant 2 years until Shawn Michaels rose up. He was beaten by some thugs in Syracuse, New York, in real life, and he collapsed on Raw in a match with Owen Hart. He comes back to win the Royal Rumble in 1996, and then he has a 60-minute match with Bret Hart in 1990, in 1996. And then he loses that match and goes away. And while he's away, Stone Cold Steve Austin is rising in prominence because Stone Cold Steve Austin won the 1996 King of the Ring. And he won the finals against Jake the Snake Roberts. And at this time, Jake the Snake Roberts was doing a religious gimmick, right? And in this religious gimmick, he would quote the Bible. So Stone Cold Steve Austin gets a thing, quotes the Bible, and he says, Austin 3:16 says, "I just whipped your ass." Automatically becomes a huge star overnight by saying these words. Austin 3:16 says, "I just whipped your ass," and he challenges Bret Hart to a match at Survivor Series. So after months and months and months, Bret Hart comes back at Survivor Series, and at this time, like I said, internet is just coming out. It's 1996. The internet just really started in the early 90s. It's really on its first legs of things, and wrestling fans are starting to look up things on the internet. Like I said, in the 2000s, internet really affected movies. in the 2010 affected movies, 2000s affected music, but in the 90s it affected wrestling. Wrestling was one of the first things hit. So, internet fans hear about Bret Hart getting this 20-year deal with WWE. That Vince McMahon paid millions of dollars to get this 20-year deal with WWE for Bret Hart, so that he wouldn't jump ship to WCW, right? So he comes out on Raw, he does that, and then at WrestleMania 13, he turns heel. He turns to a bad guy. Him and Stone Cold Steve Austin do the famous shift where one turns good and one turns evil. And he forms the Anti-American Heart Foundation. And he's all pro-Canada, and the American guys are the good guys in America, and the bad guys in Canada, and the Canada guys are the good guys in Canada, and the bad guys in America. So, anyway, long story short, come Survivor Series 97, Vince McMahon says to him, I can no longer afford to pay you what I wanted to pay you, so I want you to go to WCW. So he says, well, how are you going to have me drop the title to Shawn Michaels, who's the #1 contender? He says, I don't care. We'll just have the Hart Foundation and Shawn Michaels' group DX come out, and we'll start battling each other, and then what they call in wrestling a schmaz, and then a double disqualification. Well, that doesn't happen. As soon as Shawn Michaels gets Bret Hart, the sharpshooter, Vince McMahon says, ring the fucking bell. And it was real. You know what I mean? He really switched the script on him. You know, it wasn't a work, like they call it in wrestling. It wasn't fake. It was real. Bret didn't know the ending. And he spits in Vince McMahon's face. He goes backstage and he actually punches Vince McMahon for real. You know what I'm saying? So then now he's in WCW as a special referee in Starrcade, but they don't utilize him. They completely drop the ball. And they bust this year-long storyline with Sting and the NWO. And it's just like, you completely shit the bed. So WWE begins to rise and rise again, and they start to create stars like The Rock, stars like Chyna, stars like DX. Again, kids getting in trouble like they did with Beavis and Butthead for saying things like suck it, coming out really saying irreverent things from wrestling. There are these magazines with Marlena, magazines with Sunny that were showing breast. They even had like Sable and Chyna appear in a Playboy. Your mom is thinking, you're watching just regular wrestling right on TV. But she doesn't know that it's so raunchy and so different from what it used to be in the 80s when Hogan and them were there. That you're completely getting away and watching this craziness, And it was just really fun in those days because you never knew what was going to happen. You know what I mean? Vince McMahon was going to have his truck filled up with cement. He was going to pee himself on national TV. Again, we saw the return of women's wrestling at WrestleMania 14 with Sable. When Sable, Luna, and Mark Merrill had that mixed tag match. But a company that we did also see the return of the debut of was ECW. ECW was Extreme Championship Wrestling. Initially, when WCW parted ways with the NWA, which was their longtime affiliate, they NWA promoter Dennis Corleone decided to launch the Eastern Championship Wrestling again with the help of Paul Heyman, formerly Paulie Dangerously, the manager from WCW. So, anyway, there's a finals to their final tournament, and finally, Shane Douglas says to all the NWA legends like Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair, they could all kiss my ass. He throws down the Eastern Championship Wrestling title and he wields the Extreme Championship Wrestling title. And from that point on, you had Extreme Wrestling. So wrestling had kind of taken a turn, just like music and just like TV, to where it was wholesome and it was good in the 80s. And it was like, it didn't push any buttons, it didn't push any boundaries. But down the 90s, it was pushing all these boundaries. It was following gangster rap and it was following grunge music, and it was extreme wrestling. And it was just fun, man. Because in ECW, you could go to an ECW show, and people be like, you fucked up, you fucked up, and they'd be chanting EC Dub, EC Dub. It was just a great thing. And Mick Foley had this promo where he wanted to be a bad guy in ECW. He said the only way to be a bad guy in ECW is to not be hardcore. So somebody had assigned Kane Dewey, his 2-year-old boy. So he says to him, you had a sign that said Kane Dewey. Dewey Foley is a 4-year-old boy. You sick sons of bitches. And it was like, whoa, like you never heard no thing like that on wrestling when you watched it when I was little. So it was just a new progression. It's like everything else in society kept progressing, becoming more edgy. Because you did have, even in sports, you had the X Games, you had extreme sports, you had the rise of Tony Hawk, right? Just a lot of edgier stuff. The 90s was just very edgy, I mean, you had your Sugar Corn Pop, like Bop by Hanson. But then you had videos like Fiona Apple's Criminal, where it was just like, damn, she's on the floor, she's looking like she's addicted to heroin or something. Like she was so skinny, right? So it was just a very edgy decade, defined by living on the edge and having fun. Having fun. It was the decade of extreme. That's what I call it. The decade of extreme. I said that the 2000s was defined by the war on terror. I said the 2010s was defined by speculative fiction like Disney. Oh, but Disney, before I end this video, Disney in the 90s, that was the Disney Renaissance. Disney had experienced a decade in the 70s and 80s that was very low. After the 60s, 70s, and 80s, after the death of Walt Disney, they couldn't really resurrect themselves ever again. And it wasn't until the Who Framed Roger Rabbit movie that they finally changed course on that. They changed course on their success because all those other movies were no good. Don Bluth was kicking their ass. Now they changed course in their success. Little Mermaid comes out in 1989. It changes course in their success, and they reach a pinnacle up until Jeffrey Katzenberger leaves the company in 1994 in The Lion King that they had not been able to surpass until the 2010s. They had Hunchback of Notre Dame. They had Pocahontas. They had Little Mermaid. Every year they were coming out with a different Disney movie. Pocahontas people really didn't like because they said it was an ill depiction of history. But I think a lot of kids really didn't care about the history of it. They just liked the songs, So they kind of reinvented themselves. Aladdin, one hit after another until they did with The Lion King. And The Lion King was again in 1994, it was a phenomenon, The Lion King. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was liking it. You know, it was something that we'd never seen before in terms of animation. Now, in 1995, Pixar came out with Toy Story again with one of the guys I talked about earlier, Tom Hanks, again topping himself and coming out with one of the greatest movies of all time. When I saw this movie Thanksgiving in 1995, this movie blew me away. That's how great it was. It changed the face of animation completely. Blew me away. Blew me away. And I like Tim Allen's performance too. But Tom Hanks' performance, Tom Hanks solidified to me why he was the actor of the 90s. So, in terms of overall, like I said, it was defined by freedom, it was defined by lawlessness, it was defined by expression, and it was defined by being extreme and by creativity and newness. You know, rap, you had the G-Funk, you had the East Coast, West Coast, you had the death of Tupac and Biggie. But besides the death of Tupac, Biggie, and Selena, one death I wanted to talk about, and this is really in the news a lot nowadays with the resignation of Meghan Markle from the royal family, was the death of Princess Diana. When Princess Diana died in 1997, I was such in shock because I never really I saw people, Sammy Davis Jr. die. I saw Jim Henson die in 1989, and I saw the reaction to that. But I really didn't see a death like that ever before in my whole life, and how people react to it, and how the song "Candle in the Wind," Elton John's interpretation for her, was very popular and really touched the hearts and minds of people. You know what I mean? It was just the worst death in the 90s for me. I know Freddie Mercury also passed away that decade, and Eazy-E. But for me, the death I'll remember is Princess Di. She was beautiful. She was the people's princess, and she defied the rules and moralities of the stupid royal family, just like Meghan Markle is now. So kudos to her, rest in peace to her, and rest in peace to, not rest in peace, but peace to Meghan Markle. One thing, too, that defines the 90s for me as a Michael Jackson fan was his History album. People say his History album was a repeat of his album, his other albums, because it was the greatest hits. It's a double disc CD, But a lot of the newer songs were just as good. You Are Not Alone was a phenomenal video. People lampoon it because they said, oh, well, that was during the period that he was fake married to Lisa Marie Presley. First of all, we don't know if there was ever really love between him and Lisa Marie Presley. There might have been, so we can't really say. But we do know that Kiss at the VMAs in 95 was pretty awkward. Oh, well. But it's a memorable moment that'll stick out in your minds in the 90s. And don't say it won't, because it will. Think of Michael Jackson kissing Lisa Marie Presley in 95, and you will remember it. So, yeah, that's pretty much all that happened in the decade. Eritrea was founded as a country. Namibia was founded as a country. And Madonna made a huge theatrical comeback with the movie Evita. That's when she was pregnant with her daughter, and she was looking really good, really scrumptious in that movie. And I liked some of the songs, so I remember seeing it. And England also made a comeback in the 90s for a while, when you had famous girl group Spice Girls. I remember my grandma dragging me to see that shit. Like, why are you dragging me to see? I don't even like the Spice Girls. Jeez, it was one of the worst movies ever. But yeah, that to me really started me crazy. I remember hearing that shit on the radio, and I was like, "What the hell is this shit?" Same with Britney Spears. "Baby Hit Me One More Time" was like okay, you're encouraging male abuse of you. You know, like what? I'm not saying that Brittany became wasn't um one of the biggest artists of the 1990s. She was, but she she wasn't my cup of tea. That's for sure. Will Smith came back. Will Smith is a guy I don't want to leave the decade without mentioning. He was huge in the 90s. He had movies like Independence Day, movies like Men in Black. You know, his movie career really blew up. And then in 1997, he decided to come back with his music career, getting jiggy with it. Da na 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 na, getting jiggy with it. And it was kind of corny because now he's not the Fresh Prince anymore. He's back as Will Smith. And people didn't really like him, but he always seemed to win these awards. It's kind of like that mainstream hip hop that started with Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer, kind of snowballed into uh, him. I always say it's funny that the decade started in 1990 with Vanilla Ice and ended in 1999 with Eminem. So it's like you started with a white guy, you ended with a white guy. Of course, Eminem was better than Vanilla Ice, way better. But it's just funny how that whole thing went down. You know, 90s, a decade of excitement, a decade of extreme on every end. You know, we had political assassinations, genocides, wrestling, wrestling boom, freaking, you know, fake marriages here and there, Jerry Springer, this and that. It's just a crazy time to be alive, man. But um, yeah, technology seemed like it was on the rise and rise and rise, but then it almost seemed like a bust with Y2K. Like I said in my 2000s video, Y2K was a nothing burger, nothing happened. But then the political events um, that we chose to ignore because we were too busy focusing on President Clinton getting a blowjob in the White House, um, our chickens came home to roost because Bin Laden and Al Qaeda attacked the embassy in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998 in the USS Cole in 1999. And 2001 um, would lead to um, 9/11. So I mean, we started off good. We started off fighting in the Middle East, and we ended fighting in the Middle East, kind of bookends of the era. But I don't know. I was a kid back then. I had fun in the 90s. I love the 90s. TP for my bunghole. Uh, MTV was rocks. MTV kind of revolutionized teen request music with Total Request Live in the 90s. And then BET kind of did the same thing with 106 in Park. So it was kind of like our generation's version of American Bandstand versus Soul Train. 106 in Park had the rap battles, which was kind of a prelude to the musical talent contest that would be just in the 2000s. And MTV had the Real Rock and Roll Rules, which was kind of a prelude to what would exist in the 2000s. In terms of teen dramas, like I said, we had a lot of teen dramas because WB came out. After Fox came out, WB also came out. And they introduced a lot of teen dramas like Dawson's Creek, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, like Seventh Heaven, which is a show that no one talks about anymore, and rightfully so because of Stephen Collins. But I like the show presenting something wholesome on TV that was different. It was different. We had all that raunchy stuff. Now we have the wholesome stuff. Roseanne was a unique show because we take on white people in poverty. So that was unique. It was all about different unique perspectives and kind of
showing extremes in our society and how our society was in the beginning stages of dealing with advancement, peace. But in the end, I think the phrase that epitomizes the 1990s, I would say, is the nasty 90s because we weren't afraid to get nasty, we weren't afraid to get raunchy, we weren't afraid to get down and dirty because it was the 90s and the war was over. Cold War was finally over and we loved it. You know, we were going to a different war later, but the hell with it. While it lasted, we partied, man. You know, people could say, well, you partied, you got it crunk in the 2000s, but in the 90s, man, we got it. We were grinding in the 90s, man. You know, remember that MTV show, Grind? So that was the 90s for me. It was a fun, laid back time. I was a kid back then, so a lot of things I talked about was very kid related. But you had to grow up sometime, and in a way, it was a growth up period for the world. You know, you had the end of the Cold War, but then you had the beginning of the war on terror. So you had that brief period, like the teenage years, you just enjoy and just rock on and rock off. But now you had to go into something serious. You can no longer turn your back to what was going on in the world. Peace.